Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Corby Eason. I'm here at Utah State Board of Education and just here for our monthly school-based mental health webinar. Today we are fortunate enough to have Michael Staley from the Utah Department of Health Office of the Medical Examiner. And today he will get us a great presentation about responding to Utah suicide crisis among our youth. And so now I am going to turn the time over to Michael Staley.
Thanks, Corby, for having me today. And with this background that you all can see, I feel like I need like the Tonight Show band and that I should start with a joke. But unfortunately, all of the jokes that we tell at the medical examiner's office are not appropriate here. So my name is Michael Staley, and I am the new Suicide Prevention Research Coordinator at the Office of the Medical Examiner. My position was created by the legislature last session in response to the epidemic proportions of youth suicide that we have in our state. And to be sure, my position is not specific to youth. And in fact, the legislature had intended that I would conduct psychological autopsies on all people who died by suicide in any given year. But psychological autopsies are extremely resource intensive, and it would take 4 of me to do the interviews and another 3 of me to do that kind of analysis. And so this first year I've said we're going to focus on 10 to 17-year-olds, and that's why I'm here in front of you today. What do we know about suicide among youth in Utah now? We have some answers, but we honestly have more questions than we do answers. We get our information from 2 different sources. The first of those sources was from a CDC EpiAid, which was conducted last spring of 2017. This team of researchers looked at data from 2011 to 2015 among youth, specific to Utah. So we're not talking about national data here. We're talking very specifically about Utah. And they talked about, reviewed cases on completed suicides, those who actually were able to succeed in their suicide, tragically. They also looked at those who attempted suicide and those who thought about suicide. And importantly, in suicide research, we refer to these 3 groups of people individually. They're separate populations, even though obviously these groups have a lot in common with one another. But in terms of analysis, we break them into 3 different groups, and that's important as we go forward in this presentation. We also have current data, which primarily comes from the Utah Medical Examiner's database. That's my office. Also the National Violent Death Reporting System, or NVDRS, if you perhaps maybe have heard of it referred to as UTVDRS, the Utah Violent Death Reporting System, and also other kinds of death records. The first part of this presentation on what we already know is on those who completed suicide victims. And again, this information comes from the CDC EpiAid, which looked at deaths from 2011 to 2015. You've probably heard some of these statistics before, alarming as they are, but in 2015, the crude rate of suicide among 10 to 17-year-olds in our state was 11.1 per 100,000. Now, that's approximately twice, even a little more than twice of what the national average was at the same time. That's incredibly alarming. Suicide among all people in Utah, the rate of suicide among all people in Utah is higher than it is throughout the rest of the country. But certainly this applies to youth as well. Also, you should know that we're not the only state that has this kind of statistic. Other Rocky Mountain states like Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, etc. also share these same grim statistics. Between 2011 and 2015, the rate of suicide increased by 136%. At the same period of time, it increased by 24% nationally. Now, both of these rises are tragic and something that we need to work against to prevent. However, our rate increased, fourfold, fivefold of what the national rate did. So something is going on here in Utah, in our Rocky Mountain region, that we need to figure out. The method of death, how young people completed their suicide, either by suffocation or by firearm, were roughly the same, 47% and 46%. Now that becomes important because what we see in adult populations is that adults use firearms at twice the frequency as they do other methods, like hanging coming in second. The next few slides I'm going to talk about are actual risk factors and domains of risk factors. The first of those is mental health. By the way, at the top of the slide, you can see that the font is red. And as long as that font is red, we're talking about individuals who completed suicide. And of those who died by suicide, 36% had a mental health diagnosis, 24% had depressive symptoms at the time of their death, and 84% of those who had a mental health diagnosis were in treatment. This tells us a couple of different things. First of all, we need to increase participation in mental health therapy and of course, get our young people to the mental health care that they need. I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, when I say that here. But importantly, we often view that as the goal, that we've done exactly all that we need to do once we get a person into therapy. And these statistics show us that's not true. We've got a long way to go in terms of treating suicidal people. There is an initiative called the Zero Suicide Initiative that's launching as we speak, and that will be improving the care that we provide to those people who express that they want to end their life and within the mental health care system. In earlier pilot studies and broader studies of the Zero Suicide Initiative, they were able to reduce the number of suicide deaths by 80%. That's tremendous, and so I'm extremely hopeful about that program. Suicidality, the capacity of somebody to end their own life. Of those who died by suicide, 14% of them had thought about suicide, 16% had attempted suicide previously, and 24% had told someone that they wanted to die. Now, normally what we see in this suicidality funnel, when we're looking at general population statistics, not specific to those people who have died, is that we see a huge number of people who think about suicide, followed by a much narrower or smaller number of people who have attempted suicide, and finally an even smaller number, thank goodness, of people who have completed suicide. But among those people who completed their suicide, the funnel doesn't exactly take the same shape. We see attempters being a bigger category than ideators. Now, obviously, logic says that if you attempted suicide, you thought about suicide. So, but we do know that it tends to be a more direct path when it comes to suicidality. When we say that they disclosed their intent to die by suicide, we mean that they either told a parent or a friend. Somewhere in that death investigation, we learned that they had said that they wanted to die previously. That means we need to do two things. One, we need to take people seriously. You know that, when they say that they want to end their life. It also means that we need to improve and increase our young people's ability to seek out help. 76% of those who completed suicide never told anybody, as far as we know, that they wanted to die. And that is an area where we can do better prevention and better intervention. And finally, 47% left a departure note, a suicide note. Among the general population, we see about 1 in 5 people leave a suicide note, whereas about half of youth did so. Why is that important? Because if somebody's taking the time to write a departure note, whether it be moments before they enact their terminal event, or days or months or even years before they actually do that final act, that means they've been thinking about it for a period of time, that it's not an impulsive decision. We are much more better equipped to deal with people who have been thinking about suicide than we are people who act impulsively. A crisis before a terminal event is defined as some major event that happened right before that death, immediately before that death, whether it be a few hours or in a day. But outside of a day, it wouldn't be considered a crisis event. 56% of youth who completed their suicide had a crisis event immediately prior to their death. Those consisted of family relationship problems, problems with mom and dad, as well as intimate partner relationship problems, boyfriends and girlfriends. Sexuality. Now, when I started at the medical examiner's office this summer, I did several different interviews with KUED, KUER, the radio station, and all in a very respectful way. After I introduced myself and gave them my position, they would say, well, okay, now that you're here, can you tell us how many young gay Mormons died by suicide? And the answer is, even with the data I'm showing you and telling you about today, we still cannot answer that question. If you take the time to look at the comments under an article in the Salt Lake Tribune on suicide, you'll see that there are a lot of assumptions out there about who these youth are that are taking their own lives. And the fact remains today, even after the data that I present to you, that we still don't have the answers. And so I just want you to know that before we go forward. But the CDC EpiAid was able to talk about sexuality. For the first time, we have some data, even though it's very incomplete data, about students or young people's sexuality. Out of the 150 people who...
I think something happened. I'm going to have you pause right now.
Oh, we're going to pause. We're still here. We're just still trying to work out some technical difficulties here in the studio. Okay, we got the green light. Okay, so back to sexuality. So for the first time, we were able to abstract data about sexuality. So out of 150 young people who died between 2011 and 2015, they were able to determine the sexual orientation of 40 of those decedents. And of those 40 decedents, 6 or 15% identified as something other than heterosexual. Now, this number might be overreported, because if you're a death investigator and you go into a death scene and you see a note, say, on a young person's desk or on their phone that's to or from a girlfriend, and let's just assume the decedent is a male, and so the note is from a female, the death investigator may not actually take note of that or of the sexuality of that decedent, because it's normal. It's the default. Kind of like if you go into a home and all the pictures are on the wall and all the furniture is in place, you may not think of that as notable. Whereas if, let's just say in the same example, that investigator went into the scene and saw notes from another male that were romantic in nature, that's unusual to our investigator, and they would probably make note of that. So it's possible that the number of non-heterosexual people that are represented here are overrepresented. We're not sure. The important thing here is that 73% of decedents had missing data in this variable. We weren't able to determine their sexuality. We're going to address that a little bit later on. I'm going to talk about that in part 2 of this presentation. But while it's exciting that we were able to get some data, this data is very incomplete and really doesn't allow us to make a lot of conclusions. The other part of that is, another component is religion. They use 2 different methods in terms of religion to figure out if a decedent was religious or not. In the first method, they actually looked at the death investigation and said, did this person identify as being of a specific faith? Or the family explicitly stated during the death investigation that this young person was a person who attended religion. They determined that 40% of these decedents were religious, and of those, 81% were LDS. Now, of course, that makes sense in our state, knowing what we know about our state in terms of religious demographics. In the second method, our investigators expanded their scopes to look at obituaries and other documents. So in the second method, maybe the decedent didn't explicitly say that they were a member of a certain faith or church, but they did have a religious funeral. In other words, their obituary said the funeral will be held at such and such time at such and such workhouse. In that case, our researchers would have counted that person as religious, and they determined that 58% were religious using those research parameters. of which 85% were LDS. What we do know about religion, even after the CDC report, is that generally speaking, this is very complicated, but generally speaking, religion is still a protective factor against suicide. When you measure religion in terms of sociologically, we have to look at it as though it were a three-legged stool. One is identity, or just that simple label. The other is spirituality. Did that person actually believe those things that were part of that label? And the other component is religiosity, or did they not attend church services, and how often? In this study, we were only able to capture what that label component, that identity component. Technology. Now, this is a really big deal. Nowhere in literature before this CDC EpiAid did this emerge. So if you're going to go out there and get on, your journal searching device, you're probably not going to find research on this. 13% of decedents reported being restricted from their. Our researchers reported that 13% of decedents were restricted from their cell phone immediately preceding their death. In other words, mom or dad has an argument with the young person, and then the parent takes away the phone. And in this case, the mom took away the phone, the decedent retreated, and then 5 hours later was found hanging in his closet in this specific incident. Technology restriction, this is important, was not different among those who had a mental health diagnosis, among whites and non-whites, among younger teens to older teens. This finding applied broadly to all decedents. There was no one group that stood out as this one group, when restricted from their cell phone, are more at higher risk of suicide. What does this finding mean, though? We're not entirely sure just yet. This is a brand new research finding, and we have a lot more work to do. Of course, for those of you who are parents and of course work in school systems, this shouldn't come as a huge shock to you. You know that young people are attached to their phones in ways that we adults are not. When I'm on vacation, my phones are off, and I frankly don't want them to ring. But a phone represents some level of social connectedness to young people that we need to explore and understand better. Certainly, we can't tell parents to, not take away their son or daughter's cell phone, because that is a very powerful leverage in terms of adapting behaviors that parents want adapted. But what we do know is that we need to re-explore the boundaries and things that we set for young people and cell phones. Self-harm is not a new risk factor when we're talking about suicidality. We've known about it for a long time. And in our reviews, 21% of young people who died by suicide between 2011 and 2015 had a history of cutting or were cutting at the time of their death. We also know, this wasn't part of the CDC EpiAid, but we also know that young people are cutting in places that are hidden, such as under parts of their underwear, on their hip, or further down on their legs, places, that we would, maybe if we're checking for self-harm, we would ask them to expose their wrists or their arms. And we know that young people are not just cutting on their arms anymore. And at Autopsy, we have found that young people are cutting on their hips or lower on their legs in an effort to hide it from parents or physicians or other people who might check. Of course, this raises some very valid points about privacy, right? We can't just ask people to strip down and to determine whether or not they're cutting. That is not productive and might actually cause more harm. We're shifting gears now to those young people who attempted suicide in that same period. And we get this information from hospital discharge data, from emergency rooms, etc. Between 2011 and 2014, so the 2015 data wasn't available when our researchers were looking at the data, they found that 3,005 young people were seen in an emergency room, and of those, 690 were hospitalized. Hospitalization in this case doesn't mean sent specifically to a psych unit. This means any kind of hospitalization. Those of you in southern Utah know that there isn't a psych ward in your community. And so finding a psych bed might involve sending that young person to the Wasatch Front. And so this is broadly hospitalization. The most common method among attempters is self-poisoning, 71%, over 2/3. And of course, that has everything to do with the level of lethality. There's a period of time after someone ingests a large period pills, they might have second thoughts and seek out help, or they might be discovered and resuscitated. The next method was cutting or piercing. And so when we find in those previous slides I showed you on young people who completed suicide, cutting and piercing is something we definitely cannot ever downplay. We have to take that very seriously. Now, as a researcher, I get to have my biases and bring them to my presentations. There's a lot more information I could tell you about those who attempt suicide. But one of the most interesting things I found in this portion of the report was the disparities in care following an attempt. Males were more likely than females to be transferred to a psychiatric unit if they were suicidal. Now keep in mind that more females attempt suicide than males. Older teens, 15 to 17, compared to that 10 to 14-year-old age group, were also more likely to be transferred to a psychiatric unit. And finally, this one really caught me off guard. Hispanic youth were 60% less likely to be transferred to a psychiatric unit than their white non-Hispanic peers. There are many different explanations for that. One of them could be differences in insurance and whether the insurance might cover that. Another might be that that there's a cultural barrier of some kind that prevents our Hispanic young people from being admitted or being allowed to be admitted to a psychiatric unit. And the other is that perhaps these Hispanic youth live in rural places where there is no psychiatric unit or bed for them to be admitted into. We just don't know. But we do know that we have disparities in mental health care, and that came through in our CDC EviAid. Shifting onto this third group, those people who think about suicide, and we get this from the ever omnipotent SHARP survey, which all of you, I'm sure, know more than you ever wanted to know about. And apologies if this is repetitive information to you, but in that 2011 to 2015 period, 1 in 5 had considered or planned a suicide in the previous year. 9% had attempted a suicide. And this is the one that I have to take home with me and think about because it really just grips my heart. Almost 1 in 4 youth grades 6 to 12 reported that they felt so hopeless that they stopped doing the normal things that they were doing. Hopelessness, if we think about suicide in terms of a pipeline or a pathway, hopelessness is one of those huge roots. If you're hopeless, why return tomorrow? Why engage socially? Hopelessness is an epidemic among our young people, and we have to do better at identifying hopelessness and also restoring hope within young people. Now, that's a huge task, I know, but really, that's foundational. Here's some things you probably already know. Females are more likely than males to attempt suicide. We know that older teens, 15 to 17-year-olds, are more likely to consider suicide. 8th graders were more likely than 12th graders to think about suicide, but 10th graders were more likely than either of those grades to think about suicide. So your sophomores, your 10th graders, those are the young people who we know are thinking about suicide the most. We know that non-white students, even though in our overall numbers they account for many fewer individual cases, we know that non-white students are at higher risk for suicidal ideation than their white peers. And as I said earlier, religious youth were at lower risk. They thought about suicide less, and that's particularly true of LDS youth. We have a lot more work to do on this religious finding as we move forward, but generally speaking, religion is a protective factor. And finally, youth who perceived, not necessarily took or ingested drugs or alcohol, but youth who simply perceived drugs and alcohol as dangerous were at a lower risk. Now, at this conference that I was at last weekend, and maybe some of you were there as well, it was sponsored by USBE, Kathy Davis and Student Services had this great conference, and it started out with Becca Stevens, who's from Thistle Farms in Tennessee, and she started out by telling the audience something extremely refreshing, which was, I'm going to tell you something very old. It's old news, it's old. But just because it's old doesn't mean it's not important. And sometimes what's old works. Having family dinner was a protective factor for people so that they didn't think about suicide. Those who reported having family dinner frequently thought about suicide less. And having parents who have clear rules and expectations about not drinking any alcohol also, those young people were at a lower risk. Now, as a sociologist, I look at this finding and I say this is a proxy for something else. This might be about clear boundary setting, period. This might be about parents being more involved with the young person's life, or even increased levels of monitoring of that young person's life. It could be about parental involvement, in other words. Here are some risk factors, though. Having violent families. That's an old finding. We've known that since the very first ACEs study came out in the last century. Having people in their family who yell or insult each other, feeling like their family argues about the same things over and over again, and feeling like those arguments are serious. Those are all risk factors. School, those 6, 7, or 8 hours where students spend every single day. We know that thoughts about suicide increase in schools when there is bullying on school property. No surprise there. We also know when students are being electronically bullied, and when there is a history of substance abuse and a high perceived availability of drugs and guns. Again, none of these probably are particularly new to you, but they emphasize where our prevention efforts need to focus. Now, when I was in high school, I look younger than I actually am, but when I was in high school, there was no Facebook. My phone could merely dial a number and receive calls. I fortunately did not have to take this home with me. The insults and slurs and things that were projected at me during high school, I left at 3:20 every single day. And our young people are taking that home on their device, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and they might not be telling their parents about it. Bullying is now a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week endeavor, and that makes bullying all the more serious. Now, after the CDC EvidenceBased, 2015 seems like it was forever ago. We're now in 2018, 3 years later. What's happened since then? Well, the CDC EvidenceBased reported that suicide increased by 136%. Since then, the numbers have, yes, they went up between 2011 and 2015, but now they've really plateaued. That's not a good thing. It could be worse. They could have kept it going up, but it's not a good thing that they plateaued at this extremely high rate. There were 43 deaths in 2015, 33 in 2016, and 44 suicides in 2017. 2017 wasn't so long ago, and we're still finalizing these numbers. That's why there's that asterisk there by 2017. That number might go up or down by plus or 2, but at the outset, we were looking at 44 suicides, which technically, yes, that makes it the worst year on record for youth suicide in Utah. If you average the rates of these 3 years, though, suicide has really generally plateaued in this rate. That means that we're doing a lot of good things. We need to do more of those good things, but it also and critically means that we need to do better targeted prevention and better and targeted interventions. We want this to go down. We don't think plateau is a good place to be. The who, what, why, and where of the data since 2015. A third of all youth suicides occurred in females compared to 1/4 of adult females. What we see in the general population is that 3 and 4 suicides are men. And what we see in youth suicides is that 2 and 3 suicides are young men, whereas a third are female. So we know that females are completing suicide at a higher rate when they're young than when we get older in terms of the general population. Across the past 4 years, March and April tended to account for higher proportions of deaths than any other months. Now that's, there would be a huge standard deviation here if I was actually giving you the numbers. January, for example, in 2017 was a terrible, tragic month in our state for youth. However, on the whole, March and April tended to account for higher proportions of deaths. Most suicides occur here in the Wasatch Front. No surprise there because most of the population lives here. But importantly, the rates are higher in rural places. We have to do a better job of doing comprehensive community-level prevention in rural places. And as someone who came from Podunk, Montana, Dylan, if you ever want to go there, great place to fly fish. But as somebody who comes from a rural community, I know that this is an opportunity. This is not a disadvantage. Rural people know each other, and rural people look out for each other. When my mom goes to Costco, she has her lists and 10 of her neighbors' lists to go with her. And if there's that level of connection, then there absolutely is opportunity to do better prevention. Hanging in firearms. This is true of 2011 to 2015, all the way to present. But we know that young people are hanging themselves and using firearms to end their lives at approximately the same rate, the same proportion died using those two different methods. We have a big means restriction campaign that that's launched, has been live for some time, called Is Your Safety On? We need to do more of that, of course, because 46% of young people in this period ended their lives using a firearm. But we also know that it's not just firearms that we have to look out for. We also have to treat root causes. Now, we know some things about young people who die by suicide in our state and who think about an attempt suicide as well. But there remains a very big burning question, and that's why? Why do young people take their own lives? And for suicidologists and prevention experts, we also need to know why now? A person can be bullied for years, months, extended period of time. Somebody can struggle with mental illness for years, and then all of a sudden one day, that's the day that they decide to take their life. We're not very good, frankly, at answering the why now question, and we need to get better at answering that question in addition to just why, as if why wasn't big enough, right? Of course, people who have died by suicide, we can't ask them why they decided to end their life. But we do have other tools in our tool belt to be able to get at that. The biggest and most widely accepted is a psychological autopsy. Many of you have heard of psychological autopsy, and I want to set the record straight. Psychological autopsy was a research method to understand people who died, to reconstruct the social circumstances around them before they died, that was developed after World War II to study the lives of World War II vets. And since then, it's been used to characterize death investigations that were nothing more than reviews of a single document, all the way down the pike to characterize research that has involved interviewing lots of people surrounded to one individual person, including medical documents, psychological records, prison records, educational records, etc. And that's more what we're about. In 2008, the American Association of Suicidology standardized what constitutes a psychological autopsy. It includes a minimum of 4 interviews of informants, people who knew the decedent, as well as document review, and as well as inclusion of all of the information that was gathered in the death investigation. Psychological autopsy, of course, is used in research when we use the findings in aggregate. Psychological autopsy can tell us a lot about one individual death, but when we're talking about public health and prevention, we need to summarize what we find. And so this is about aggregate results, not individual deaths per se. So, like I said, it involves a minimum of 4 individuals who knew the decedent well, involves the death investigation, and archival document review. These are a lot of things coming at you fast. I'll make sure that these slides are available to you after this presentation, but I'm going to give you a whole bunch of variables here. Demographic information is one of those things we collect in psychological autopsy, as well as religion, employment, financial status, social connectedness. Did this person have quality friendships with their peers? Romantic relationships and sexuality. Suicide contagion and clustering. I don't know if you heard of this TV show called 13 Reasons Why. I know, I hear the collective sigh all the way in this soundproof studio in Salt Lake City. The 2nd season is coming out this spring, by the way. But we actually can measure this. If we have good information about somebody's Netflix history, now that seems weird to get a decedent's Netflix history, but that might be important. We know because perhaps they had this romantic idea of suicide that they got from a specific TV show that rhymes with 13 Reasons Why. We can measure that. Their demonstrated suicide risk before they died. Did they attempt suicide? Did they have access to lethal means? Crisis events. Did they have arguments, depression, anxiety, sleep patterns? Have you heard of vamping? I just learned about this a couple of weeks ago, where young people will take their cell phone, whether it was restricted or not, and take it into their bedroom at night and be on Snapchat or Instagram or whatever social media platform they choose, and they'll sit there and they'll chat with their friends all night long and come to school the next day looking like they were dragged through the mud, so tired. We know that young people's sleep patterns are changing more now than they ever have in the past, and we need to know why and how. We also look at physical health and illness, including disability, emotional stability, lifestyle and risk-taking prior to the suicide, whether or not there was trauma. I get asked a lot whether we include ACEs in our investigation. We're going to. We're actually using an even more in-depth instrument than ACEs that will break down trauma into sexual, emotional, physical, and generalized trauma. We're looking at suicidal ideation and attempt history, drug and alcohol abuse, family mental illness and suicide history, firearm history. There's a big legislatively contracted study underway right now to study firearm use among all people in suicide deaths in our state. Were they participating in the therapy that they were prescribed, whether that be taking the medication that they were prescribed or doing the things that their therapist said that they ought to do? And this one's difficult, and you'll get my email address at the end of this. If you know of great ways to measure social media use, please lay it on me. This is a huge struggle. Snapchat we can't get access to, so the message goes away and it's gone. And that could have been something as important as a departure note or simply as just like a hi or something that they last sent to a friend. We're adding some things. So everything I just showed you, all of those factors have to be included in order for a study to be characterized as a psychological autopsy study or for an individual investigation to be characterized as a psychological autopsy. In Utah, we're adding some other elements as well. And those include bullying, for the obvious reasons I already explained. We're also expanding out that ACEs trauma history. We're also taking a big inventory of parental characteristics. Did mom and dad serve in a recent military conflict, and did they bring that PTSD home? That matters, and we need to be able to identify that as a risk factor. And we're also taking a comprehensive inventory of school experiences. For some, we know that school is such an important, enriching, wonderful place where they go and it launches them into this successful career where they become these amazing, productive human beings. And we also know that school tears down some young people to the point that we don't really launch them into a life. We more than less just dump them off after they graduate high school. And we should know whether these young people that died by suicide were having a good school experience, a bad school experience, it was mixed, or none of the above. Each psychological autopsy will allow us to summarize the risk factors. Yes, we know some risk factors to suicide, but just like this EPI-8 identified technology restriction as a new risk factor, I believe, and generally the research community believes, that there are risk factors that we do not yet know about. Conducting this big study will allow us to pinpoint or have even just better define those known risk factors. We'll also be able to summarize protective factors. And importantly, why did those factors fail? Protective factors can keep people alive for a very long time, suicidal people alive for a very long time, but this is that why now question. Why did these protective factors fail on such and such day for such and such person?
My phone number
We'll
is
also be able to detail the circumstances that led up to that individual's death, the chronological things that happened before they decided to take their own life.
Tomorrow, but tomorrow
We'll
morning,
also be
Mountain
able to make
Standard Time,
conclusions.
would work.
Why suicide? Why suicide now?
So,
Why suicide
and
by this
I'll
method? And finally, how could this suicide have been prevented? And that's the key question. That's why my position exists. That's why I'm here talking to you today and asking for your partnership ultimately. We know that we can do a better job of preventing these deaths, and we're going to get at least a much better and clearer picture about how we can do that when we understand those people, those young people who have already tragically died by their own hand. And so I'm partnering with the USBE, the Utah State Board of Education, and this slide should have said, and you too, actually it does later, and your district and your school. So I proposed this data sharing agreement with the Utah State Board of Education that was approved January 4th by the Law and Licensing Committee. That will go to the full board on February 1st. And importantly, I don't want the USBE or the folks on the education side of things to think that this is a one-way transaction where, you know, thanks for the data and I run off into the sunset. No, part of this is, of course, a data sharing partnership. I'm working with the Department of Health, the agency I work for, so that I can contact the Utah State Board of Education and specifically Kathy Davis when we're notified or learn of a young person dying so that you can respond more quickly and efficiently and appropriately to a student death in your school. Hopefully you won't have to hear from me much, but if these statistics ring true, you probably will. And above all, our partnership allows us to do better prevention for the students we serve. And that's where you come into all of this. I need your advocacy. I need your advocacy for this research to be successful. I need to partner with your district, and I'll be contacting and meeting with superintendents along with Representative Steve Elison in the coming few months so that we can get superintendents on our side. This could be as simple as providing information to me when I call you. This could be providing follow-up support after a psychological autopsy has been completed on a young person's best friend. Psychological autopsies are emotionally straining and so taxing to young people, and we are very cognizant of that. And you can be our front lines after those psychological autopsies are completed to get that young person the help that they need. And that could be simply as talking to you or you talking to their parents to advocate on their behalf or whatever you are permitted by law to do. And of course, advocating for this research within your district and within your school. This is my contact information. You're welcome to email me or call me with your questions or concerns. And I know we have time for questions and answers here today. So now is the time to, call in or, to type in your question, and I'll do my best to answer those questions. I guess I'm that good, huh? I know I'm not that good, so.
So, first is a statement. You said students of color die by suicide at a higher rate than students who are white. Is there something widely known among clinicians, therapists, and are they using a culturally responsive model to intervene that you are aware of?
Yes, a couple different responses to this question. In the general population, so not Utah specific, we know that actually being white is a risk factor. So this is actually, contrary to what the rest of the research says, that non-white young people are at a higher risk in Utah. And so that makes our specific situation quite interesting to me. When I think about that, and more broadly, I think about in-groups and out-groups and inclusion and exclusion. And again, we have a lot more work to do to understand that risk factor better. in terms of the clinical side of that, we need better culturally responsive models, particularly in treatment. So, for example, the Intermountain Healthcare has a working group on suicide prevention, and they're considering many different kinds of models to treat and to train clinicians, not just at Intermountain, but broadly within communities, to respond to a suicidal person. And one of the factors that they require is that that model be adaptable for specific cultures. And so I know that there is that is very specifically being looked at in what we do going forward. And whatever that comes from that, we need to figure out how to scale that up so that all of our suicide treatment models are adaptable for different cultures, because that's important.
We still have participants if you want to invite them to ask a question.
All right, well, if any other questions out there? We have a question, I think, that we're just getting.
So if you want us included in the conversation, how do we access training and presentations at the school or district levels?
So let me make sure I understand the question correctly. That how do we include this information when we present it to our districts and schools? Is that the question, or
more how do they include themselves in the conversation with you, I believe.
Yeah, so
how do you be involved with me? Well, if you've had a young person who's died by suicide in your school, or if you're at the district level, you'll probably be hearing from me, I would say in March, April, maybe May. I'm hoping before May, because when we think about those 4 informants who know young people best, the simple reality is that one of them or 2 of them are going to be parents, and then a best friend is usually going to be an informant, and possibly another friend. But really, in a lot of cases, you, the school counselor or a teacher in your school or administrator, are going to know more about that young person than anybody else. Sometimes we tragically know that not everybody has a friend, and in that situation, I'll be coming to you to see what you know. Obviously, we want the people who knew the decedent the best to answer my questions and to participate in the psychological autopsy. But occasionally, even if you've had only one contact or a passing contact with the student, you might be one of those people who I contact. Or, on the other hand, somebody who's had a lot of contact with a student. You're extremely valuable to the psychological autopsy process. And of course, having you as an unbiased informant is taken very seriously, and definitely I will appreciate your participation in that as well. The other part of that is it's not always easy to identify who a young person's best friend might be. Parents are often not aware of who a young person might consider their best friend, and so I'll be reaching out to you quite possibly to figure out who is in this young person's social network. I also want to add just one other piece there, which is that how can I be a resource to you? First of all, I'm more than willing to come and talk to districts, generally about suicide and on the level that I did today, and more or less. But if you, if we're worried about contagion, for example, within a specific suicide death, where it was public or there were widespread notes, something like that, and you want me to come and do psychological autopsies in advance, not for research purposes, but so that we can do acute prevention in that very moment, I can absolutely, that when we know that there are deaths imminently that we can prevent, I'm 100% at the table. Okay, those are great questions, by the way.
Um, so we have a question. Do you have any opinions about teaching students suicide prevention lesson? Like, do you have a certain curriculum um, that you prefer, like the most? I mean, what are your pros or cons about particular curriculum?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to answer this again in two different ways. First, the CDC FBA did include a review, and that's important, a document review of 3 different programs in our state. They looked at QPR, question, just went right off my tongue, question, persuade, and respond. Thank you. And as well as the Hope for Utah, or Hope Squads, which probably you're very familiar with, and the Hope for Tomorrow program that comes from, I believe, NAMI. By the way, I'm not the program guy. I would absolutely defer to Kathy Davis for that, or on a statewide level, in a community sense, you could refer to Kim Myers, the Department of Human Services. If you're interested in their contacts, we can make them available for you. So the CDC EPA did this document review, and they said the only one of these 3 programs that is considered evidence-based is QPR. Does that mean that Hope Squads and Hope for Tomorrow don't work? Absolutely not. No way, no how. And in fact, it was reported in the press that, these, in some press outlets, that these prevention programs may not have been effective, and that's not the truth. If you've got a Hope Squad, yes, you should have a Hope Squad. If Hope for Tomorrow is in your school or in your district, yes, they should be in your district. Do those programs need more evaluation? Yes, absolutely. Do they need that evidence-based and designation to be on the National Register? Yes, absolutely they do. But those are like $1 million studies that we need to get the funding, secure the funding to do that research. But again, broadly speaking, I would defer to Kathy Davis or Kim Myers for those program-specific questions. And I know that Kathy also goes to school districts and different schools to do suicide prevention training. So there are program resources available for those people and districts that are interested in participating.
We're trying to get to another question here for you. My computer crashed.
Oh no, we had the question computer crashed. So we're getting the workaround right now.
Can I ask a question orally?
Hold on just a second. They're reading me a question.
Question about childhood abuse and proxy. Could you get into the... Oh, goodness.
The gentleman that wants to ask this question orally, please go ahead.
Well, it's my question that is being struggled with. Often experiences of child abuse are not disclosed to friends or family. Do you have any thoughts about proxies that you might be able to find in your psychological autopsies to give you an indirect measure of possible prior abuse?
Well, okay, so just so that we're on the same page, we're using that bigger ACEs-like assessment to assess childhood trauma in a lot of different ways. Another thing that we're pursuing that I should have included in the Utah additions to the psychological autopsy is that if there's a DCFS history or a juvenile courts history, we'll be getting those kinds of documents hopefully as well. Those partnerships have not yet been formally shored up, but we're hoping that we can get those that information from them as well. In terms of like a proxy, like asking a separate question to get at that abuse, there's currently, there's a lot of problems with reliability and validity when we use proxies to try to measure that. But I'm very interested if you know of proxies that are being used in research that I simply haven't used. My graduate education is from the University of New Hampshire, where the Center for Crimes Against Children originates. Dr. David Finkelhorn is one of my mentors, and I've been going back and forth with him quite a bit on evaluating and trying to accurately inventory childhood trauma, and the instrument that we have is the best that we've come up with, meaning the one on hand. In terms of developing those proxy questions, there's a lot of debate in the research community about how good they are. But like I said, this is the time that we can change and adjust and do a better job of capturing that if you folks have ideas.
And ask them if they have any more questions. My chat cleared.
Okay, how about first of all, to the gentleman who asked that question live here, is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, yes, you addressed my question. You might consider asking a random sample of 18-year-olds the question of whether or not they've experienced any form of child abuse that they never told family or friends or made any official report, just to get a gauge of present rates of undisclosed abuse.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and another key part of this larger broad study outside of the psychological autopsy piece is the data that we get from SHARP and Urbis as well. And while that doesn't do a very comprehensive job of documenting childhood trauma, it does, at least give us, it points the compass generally in the right quadrant, so that we do have a comparator number that's population-based and anonymously reported to compare whatever number that we find, after psychological autopsy to know, if we're, comparable or lower, higher, et cetera. All right, sounds like there are no more questions. So speak now or type now or forever hold your peace. Or just kidding, or email me. Okay.
And so, thank you so much for participating in this month's school-based mental health webinar. And the action question for this webinar is for how are you going to get involved with your community partnerships within your community to reduce the epidemic of youth suicide here in Utah, in your community particularly. And thank you and have a great day.